A former Navy SEAL drifted into a sunburnt desert town, hoping the red cliffs and empty roads could bury the war still echoing in his chest. He had no plan, no friends, only a battered German shepherd he pulled from a filthy alley, trembling under old bruises and newer fear. When a local thug came knocking, demanding the dog back and threatening the only shelter they had, he mistook quiet for surrender. He was wrong. The real mistake wasn't the threats, or even the cruelty. It was what it awakened in a man who had sworn he'd never fight again. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Your comment means more than you know. And please, if stories of faith, courage, and healing matter to you, subscribe to the channel right now and stay with us. The desert wind was already carving through Moab's streets, rattling cheap trailer walls and fading neon where fear more than law decided who got to breathe. Winter in Moab arrived dry and sharp, the kind of cold that didn't snow so much as scrape wind threading through red cliffs, dust-stinging eyes, and the sun looking bright enough to lie. Nate Collins drove in as if the town were a checkpoint he didn't want to stamp. He was 36, American-born, with a face cut in clean angles, high cheekbones, a straight nose, a jaw that looked like it had learned to hold pain without announcing it. His hair was dark brown and kept short out of habit, and a trimmed beard shadowed his mouth just enough to make his silence feel deliberate. He wore a weathered field jacket over a plain shirt, jeans faded at the knees, and boots that placed each step as if he was still counting distance and exits. People in town read that posture the way desert folk read the sky. Something had happened to that man. Something that taught him to be ready even when standing still. Nate didn't tell stories. He didn't wear medals. He didn't correct strangers who guessed wrong about him. He had served as a Navy SEAL enough years to make discipline feel like skin, and he'd left with the kind of invisible baggage that never fit in a duffel bag. He came to Moab for the oldest lie men like him believe that if you pick a quiet place, the noise inside you will eventually get bored and leave. He rented a small trailer on the edge of town, tucked behind a stand of scrubby juniper, where the nights were mostly wind and the days smelled faintly of gasoline and sun-baked rock. That first afternoon, he went looking for work the way he'd learned to do everything methodically without making himself noticeable. He checked a few garages, a supply yard, the kind of places that paid cash for strong hands, and asked no questions. The answers were polite and non-committal, the same careful tone people used around stray dogs and thunderstorms. Nate accepted it. He always did. He was turning down an alley behind an aging hardware store when the sound found him. Thin, choked, not quite a bark, not quite a whine. It was the noise a living thing makes when it has already tried being loud and learned it only brings more trouble. Nate stopped. The alley was narrow, lined with splintered pallets and rusted scrap, and a single light above the back door flickered like it was tired of keeping watch. The smell hit him, next old urine wet rope and something metallic that made his stomach tighten. In the far corner, half hidden behind a toppled trash bin, a German shepherd lay on its side with its legs folded wrong, as if the world had instructed it to take up less space. The dog was large male, maybe 4 years old if Nate guessed by the teeth and the stubborn strength still clinging to his frame, but he was underfed ribs ghosting beneath a coat that should have looked proud. His fur was classic black and tan, though the tan was dulled by grime and the black was patched where scabs had formed and reopened. A rope dug into the thick fur around his neck, tied too tight, the fibers stained dark where skin had bled. One ear stood half upright, the other bent slightly at the tip like it had been broken once and never forgiven. His eyes were the part that hurt to look at Amber, intelligent and too careful, tracking Nate with the logic of experience, human approaches, human decides, body pays. Nate crouched at a distance, first hands visible, palms down. He didn't coo. He didn't rush. His voice came out low, even a tone used in helicopters and dark corridors meant to steady rather than excite. "Hey," he said as if greeting someone at a door. The dog's chest moved fast, shallow. A tremor ran through his hind leg. When Nate shifted closer, the shepherd flinched, not with aggression but with expectation, like he was bracing for the next lesson. Nate felt something old inside him rise, not anger yet, but recognition. He'd seen fear that looked like this in humans too, the kind that doesn't scream because it's already done the math. Nate's fingers touched the rope and the dog stiffened so hard his nails scraped concrete. Nate paused, breathed once, and kept his hand there without tightening. Not that he murmured, and the words were as much for himself as for the animal. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folding knife slowly so the blade wasn't a surprise, and sliced the rope with a clean motion. The fibers snapped apart, and the dog didn't bolt. He just lay there blinking as if freedom was another trick that might turn into pain if he moved too quickly. Nate peeled off his jacket and draped it over the shepherd's shoulders, the fabric swallowing some of the cold and some of the shame. Up close, he saw the details: bruising along the flank, a healing cut near the ribs, raw skin on the neck where the rope had rubbed. The dog smelled of dust and fear and the stubborn refusal to die. Nate slid one arm under the chest and another under the hips, careful of the back legs, and lifted. The shepherd tensed, then sagged heavy with exhaustion, but his head turned toward Nate's throat, as if listening for the truth in his heartbeat. Nate carried him out of the alley with the same steadiness he'd carried wounded teammates. No drama, no speeches, just the quiet decision that this body would not be left behind. Back at the trailer, Nate laid the dog on an old blanket, set a bowl of water within reach, and watched the shepherd stare at the bowl as if permission had to be granted by someone cruel. Nate nudged it closer. The dog drank in cautious laps, pausing to look up between swallows, checking whether the kindness had an expiration date. Nate sat on the floor back against the cabinet and let the silence settle. In that silence, he realized he had been trying to disappear, and the desert had handed him a soul that couldn't. The shepherd's breathing slowed. His eyes stayed on Nate, not trusting yet but anchored. Nate exhaled and gave him a name, like a promise. "Duke," he said softly. The dog blinked once, then rested his chin on the blanket, as if the word had weight, as if it meant you belong somewhere that doesn't hurt you. Outside, the wind combed the juniper, and the red cliffs held their ancient, amused stare, while inside, a broken man and a battered dog began the first quiet, stubborn step towards something that might resemble home. Morning came brittle and bright, the desert pretending it had never been cruel. Nate woke before sunrise out of muscle memory. Not because he had anywhere to be, but because his body still believed the day was a mission that would punish him if he arrived late. The trailer was cold enough to make his breath visible, and the thin walls held every sound: wind, distant engines, and the shallow, uneven breathing of the dog on the blanket. Duke lay on his side where Nate had placed him, the borrowed jacket bunched around his shoulders like a temporary shelter. In daylight, the shepherd looked worse in a way that made Nate's stomach tighten. The bruising along his ribs had turned the color of old storms, and his hind legs trembled when he tried to gather them under his body. Duke's eyes tracked Nate with the alertness of an animal that had learned the most dangerous moment was not the first blow but the moment after, when someone decided whether you were worth finishing. Nate moved slowly, speaking in a low voice as he checked the dog's neck where the rope had burned raw grooves into the fur. Duke flinched at the first touch, then held still with the rigid patience of someone waiting for pain to prove it was real. "Easy," Nate murmured, and he hated the way the words sounded like a command when he meant it as a promise. He found an old first aid kit in a plastic bin, wrapped the worst abrasions with gauze, and offered a piece of jerky torn into small, non-threatening bites. Duke sniffed, hesitated, then ate with quick, cautious chews, glancing up between each bite to make sure Nate hadn't changed his mind. By the time the sun climbed over the red rock, Nate had made the decision that kept echoing in his head like a warning siren. The dog needed a veterinarian, and Nate needed to walk into town with a battered German shepherd and ask for help without inviting the wrong kind of attention. He loaded Duke into the truck, carefully lifting him with both arms and bracing the dog's weight against his chest. Duke didn't struggle. He just went stiff, eyes wide, as if the truck itself was a memory. Nate drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly near Duke's shoulder, not restraining, just there, a steady point in a moving world. The clinic sat on the edge of town in a low stucco building with sun-faded lettering, Canyon Paws Veterinary. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and warm fur, the kind of clean that still carried the truth of animals who'd been afraid. A bell chimed when Nate pushed the door open, and a tabby cat perched on the front counter lifted its head like a tiny judge. The cat was an older male, thick-bodied, with a scar nicking the edge of one ear, and pale green eyes that looked unimpressed by human drama. A name tag clipped to a nearby clipboard read, Moses, and he watched Duke with a wary, calm tail tucked close as if he'd learned not to waste energy on panic. Behind the counter, a woman looked up from paperwork, and Nate felt that familiar instinct to read a room, angles, threats, exits, snap into place. Dr. Hannah Price was in her early 50s, average height, but built with the sturdy strength of someone who lifted animals for a living and didn't apologize for it. Her hair was chestnut brown streaked with silver pulled into a practical ponytail that left her face open and unadorned. She had steady hazel eyes, faint laugh lines around them, and a mouth that looked like it had practiced telling hard truths gently. A faded tattoo of a paw print peeked out from under her sleeve when she set down her pen. She didn't smile widely, but her expression softened when she saw Duke's condition the way professionals soften when they spot suffering they can fix. "Bring him back," she said, voice calm and direct, like the kind of person who had learned that hesitation can hurt. Nate followed her into an exam room painted a cheerful blue that felt like an insult against the dog's bruises. Hannah knelt beside Duke without crowding him, letting him smell her hand. Duke's ears twitched, unsure, and he gave a small, broken sound in his throat. Hannah's gaze flicked to Nate, quick assessing, and then back to the dog. "How long have you had him?" she asked. Nate swallowed. "Since last night." "Where'd you find him?" Nate's eyes moved to the window, to the parking lot, to the trucks passing on the road like indifferent beasts. "An alley." Hannah didn't press for poetry. She palpated Duke's ribs, checked his gums, examined the abrasions on his neck, and gently moved his hind legs. Duke trembled when she touched the tender areas, but he didn't snap. That restraint Hannah seemed to understand wasn't calm, it was conditioning. "He's young," she said quietly, "but he's been living like he's old." She stood and washed her hands with a brisk, practiced motion. "I'm going to do x-rays on the hips and lower spine, also blood work. He's dehydrated, underweight, and those bruises aren't from falling off a curb." Nate's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his cheekbone. "Can you help him walk?" Hannah looked at Duke, then at Nate again. "I can help him heal," she said. "But walking is partly body and partly trust. That takes time." While a technician led Duke carefully to imaging, Nate sat alone in the exam room, hands clasped so tight his knuckles whitened. He stared at a poster on the wall about heartworm prevention and felt absurdly angry at the normality of it. In his head, old training tried to turn the situation into a solvable problem, identify threat, remove threat, secure asset. But Duke wasn't an asset. Duke was a living creature who had been taught that humans were storms. And Nate, who had come here to stop being a storm, could feel the pressure building in him anyway. Hannah returned with a clipboard, and the kind of expression that meant the news was careful, not catastrophic. "No fractures," she said. "That's the good part." Nate's shoulders released a fraction. "The stiffness is likely soft tissue trauma and a hip strain. He's also got inflammation that's making him guard the back legs." She tapped the paper with her pen. "Pain medication, anti-inflammatory rest, and I want you back here in a week. If he doesn't improve, we'll look deeper." Nate nodded, listening like it was a briefing. Then Hannah's voice changed slightly, still calm but heavier. "I'm going to ask you something, and you can answer, or you cannot. But I need you to hear it." Nate met her eyes. "People who do this to dogs don't do it once," she said. "They do it because nobody stops them." Nate felt the words land in his chest like a weight. He thought of Duke on the alley floor, bracing for a pain that never stopped. He thought of himself trying to disappear so he'd never have to choose violence again. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said finally. Hannah's mouth tightened with something like sympathy. "Trouble already found you," she replied. At the front desk, Nate paid with cash that looked too small against the bill, and Hannah quietly reduced the total without making a show of charity. "Consider it a welcome-to-town discount," she said, but her eyes told him she understood the real cost. As Nate carried Duke back to the truck, Moses, the tabby cat, hopped down from the counter and followed a few steps, tail held level, as if escorting them out like a grumpy little guardian. Duke drugged lightly for pain, rested his head against Nate's forearm. For the first time, his breathing didn't sound like he was holding his life hostage. Outside, the wind lifted dust into golden spirals, and Nate realized he had done more than bring a dog to a clinic. He had stepped back into a world that asked him to care, to be seen, to choose what kind of man he would be when cruelty came calling. He started the truck, drove toward the trailer, and felt the desert watching, ancient, amused, and completely indifferent to whether humans learned their lessons. But Duke's eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, stayed on Nate as if he was the only shelter left. Nate tightened his grip on the steering wheel and kept driving, knowing one thing with unnerving clarity: healing was going to require more courage than hiding ever did. Nate drove back from Canyon Paws with the heater rattling and Duke's weight sleeping heavy across the passenger seat, the German Shepherd's chest rising in slower, steadier pulls now that pain had been dulled into something tolerable. The desert outside looked innocent in midday light, red cliffs polished by sun, juniper casting thin shadows, dust spinning in little halos. Yet Nate felt the old, familiar sensation that comes before trouble speaks its name, eyes that linger too long. Silence that isn't peace, but surveillance. At the trailer, he carried Duke inside and laid him on fresh blankets, setting water close, and the prescribed pills in a neat line on the counter like a ritual. Duke blinked up at him, ears twitching, uncertain whether care was a phase humans performed before the punishment began again. Nate sat on the floor near him and waited, giving the dog a lesson in stillness that didn't hurt. When Duke finally exhaled and let his head sink into the blanket, Nate stood and did what he'd been trying to avoid since arriving. He went into town to buy supplies because healing requires ordinary things. Food gauze, quiet. The grocery store was small and overlit, smelling of citrus cleaner and old cardboard. Behind the counter stood Linda Graves, a woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair cut into a blunt bob and reading glasses hanging from a chain like a badge of patience. Her skin was tanned from years of desert sun freckles scattered across her cheeks, and her expression carried the practical kindness of someone who's learned to be gentle without being naive. She watched Nate's basket, dog food, eggs, bread, bandages, and her gaze flicked to the bruises on his knuckles from lifting Duke the wrong way, once then away again, as if deciding what questions were safe in a town that punished curiosity. "You new here?" she said, not quite a question. "Just passing through," Nate replied, because it was easier than admitting he'd come to disappear. Linda nodded slowly, lips pressing together like she wanted to say more, but had learned to swallow words for survival. Nate paid in cash. Linda slid an extra can of broth into the bag as if it had accidentally fallen there. And when Nate looked up, she didn't smile, but her eyes held a message some people see, even if they pretend they don't. Outside, he loaded groceries into the truck and caught movement in the reflection of his side mirror. 3 men near a lifted pickup across the lot pretending to talk while watching him. One of them stood out the way a bruise stands out on pale skin. Travis Boone looked mid-30s, lean but wiry, with a long face sharpened by a narrow chin and cheekbones that made his grin look cutting rather than friendly. His hair was sandy blonde, slicked back with too much product, and a scruffy beard ringed his mouth like he'd forgotten the difference between rugged and careless. He wore a faded hoodie under a work vest, boots crusted with red dirt, and a belt buckle too flashy for a man claiming to be just another local. His eyes were the worst part, bright, restless, and hungry for control. The eyes of someone who liked seeing others flinch because it made him feel solid. Nate didn't know his name yet, but he recognized the type the way veterans recognize incoming weather. Travis's gaze dropped to the dog food bag, then lifted back to Nate with a small, satisfied smirk as if he'd confirmed a suspicion. Nate kept his face blank and shut the tailgate with controlled force. He drove away without looking back, but the sensation of being followed stayed with him like dust in his throat. At the trailer, Duke was awake, head lifted, ears angled toward the door as if he'd heard the town exhale. Nate fed him broth mixed into softened kibble, then stepped back out to look for work because money was a leash too, and he wouldn't let Duke pay for his lack of it. He tried the auto shop first, then the supply yard, and each conversation had the same polite edge. A man behind a desk nodding without meeting Nate's eyes. A foreman scratching his beard and saying they were fully staffed, a shrug that felt rehearsed. It wasn't open hostility. It was coordinated avoidance, the kind that spreads when one person in town has trained everyone else to step aside. By late afternoon, Nate found himself in front of a low building on the main road with a sign that said Red Rock Tavern in sun-faded letters. The place looked like it had been built to keep secrets. No windows facing the street. A single-door cigarette stains on the stucco. Inside, the air was dim and smelled of stale beer and fried onions, the kind of scent that clings to jackets and memories. Behind the bar stood Sarah Whitaker, early 40s, tall and slender with shoulders that carried fatigue the way a person carries a heavy purse used to it, but never forgetting the weight. Her hair was honey blonde, threaded with early gray pulled into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. Her skin was sun-worn and lightly bronzed with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hinted she'd smiled plenty once before life started charging extra for joy. She moved with quiet efficiency, wiping a glass with a towel as if the motion could scrub the past clean. When she looked at Nate, her gaze was steady, not flirtatious, not fearful, just observant, the gaze of someone who learned to read men because reading them kept her alive. "You want a drink?" she asked. Nate shook his head. "Coffee," he said. Sarah's eyebrows lifted a fraction, amused in a tired way. "Not many ask for coffee at this hour." "I'm not many," Nate replied, and the faintest curve touched her mouth as if she appreciated the honesty. She poured him a mug without asking more, then leaned her forearms on the counter at a respectful distance. "You're the guy with the shepherd," she said softly, like she was naming a storm without wanting to summon it. Nate's grip tightened on the mug. "He's resting," he answered. Sarah's eyes flicked to his hands, to the bandage tape peeking from his pocket. "Moab doesn't mind quiet," she said, voice low. "But some men here take quiet as an invitation." Nate felt Hannah's warning echo in his chest. Who, he asked, and the question came out calmer than it felt. Sarah hesitated, then looked past him toward the back of the bar where laughter rose, sharp, mean laughter from a table of men who watched the room like it owed them something. "Travis Boone," she said at last. "He calls himself a trainer, calls a lot of things training that aren't." Her jaw tightened the way it tightens when someone has learned to swallow rage, because rage can get you hurt. "If he's noticed you keep your head down," she added, and there was a sadness in it, like she hated herself for giving that advice. Nate stared into the coffee, watching the surface tremble with each distant laugh. He'd come here to hide from the part of him that knew how to end threats. But Duke's bruises had already written a different story. Nate set the mug down gently and met Sarah's gaze. "I'm not looking for a fight," he said. Sarah nodded once, slow. Neither was the dog, she replied, and the words landed like a stone. Nate left the tavern before dusk, drove home with the sky turning copper behind the cliffs, and parked his truck so the headlights faced the road. Inside, Duke lifted his head when Nate entered, and for the first time his tail made a small, cautious sweep against the blanket, as if hope had tested the air and found it safe for 1 second. Nate sat beside him, listening to the wind rake the trailer walls, and understood something with a cold clarity. The town had already chosen sides, and he and Duke were standing in the open. Night settled over the trailer park like a lid, not gentle, not romantic, just heavy, wind-driven, and full of small sounds that made the mind invent bigger ones. Nate kept the lights low and the curtains tight, not because he wanted to hide, but because he didn't want to give anyone a clean target. Duke lay on the blanket near the couch, breathing quieter now, the rise and fall of his ribs less jagged, though every so often his hind leg twitched as if his body remembered pain, even when the room didn't offer it. Nate sat at the tiny table with Hannah's medication schedule taped beside a chipped mug, his hands steady, but his thoughts loud. He could still hear Sarah's voice. Some men take quiet as an invitation, and he hated that the sentence sounded like a mission brief. He'd come to Moab to stop living like a weapon, yet the desert had handed him a living, wounded creature that required the exact kind of vigilance he'd tried to bury. Close to midnight, Duke's ears lifted first. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He just stared at the door body tensing under the jacket like a spring wound too tight. Nate felt it a second later, the subtle vibration through the trailer floor, the low rumble of an engine idling with deliberate patience. He stood without hurry, moved to the window, and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to look. Headlights washed over the gravel road like a slow searchlight, then angled away. A lifted pickup sat near the entrance of the park engine, running 2 silhouettes inside. Nate didn't need to see faces to know the kind of men who sat in trucks at midnight hoping to be noticed. He stepped back, locked the deadbolt again out of habit, and turned toward Duke. "It's fine," he said quietly, though he didn't fully believe it. Duke's eyes stayed wide, and Nate recognized the look. The dog wasn't afraid of the dark. He was afraid of what the dark usually brought. The engine noise faded after a few minutes, but the silence it left behind felt staged, like a pause in a song right before the chorus hits. Nate didn't sleep. He cleaned the small kitchen twice, checked the locks twice, and sat on the floor beside Duke with his back against the couch, letting the dog feel the warmth of a human who wasn't about to erupt. Somewhere around 2 a.m., Duke finally lowered his head, exhaustion overriding alarm. Nate watched him and felt a strange ache, an emotion that wasn't guilt exactly, but close to it. In the teams, he'd protected men who chose the fight. Duke hadn't chosen anything. Duke had been chosen by cruelty, and now by accident chosen by Nate. Morning brought a harsher kind of light, pale sun reflecting off red dust, making the world look bright and unforgiving. Nate drove into town early, not for work this time, but for supplies that made him feel prepared: a heavier chain for the trailer gate, extra batteries, a motion light from the hardware store. The owner, an older man with a stooped back and skin like leather, avoided conversation, ringing up the items with a practiced neutrality that screamed fear. Nate didn't push. He'd seen fear harden into habits before. On the way out, he noticed a flyer taped crookedly to the bulletin board by the door. Lost dog call, Travis Boone Training and Recovery. The paper showed a smiling German shepherd beside bold promises. Nate stared at it, jaw tightening. It wasn't just cruelty, it was branding. It was a man turning dominance into business. He drove home and found a surprise waiting, a girl on a bike at the edge of the trailer lane, hovering like she'd been told not to come too close but couldn't keep herself away. She was about 14, thin as a reed, wearing an oversized hoodie with the hood half up, dark hair spilling out in tangled waves. Her skin was light brown with a dusting of freckles, and her eyes were sharp in a face that still held childhood softness. She clutched the handlebars as if they were a shield. "You got a dog," she said when Nate stepped out of the truck. It wasn't admiration. It was worry disguised as curiosity. Nate nodded. "He's inside." The girl glanced around, then leaned forward, voice dropping. "Don't let Travis see," she whispered. "He'll say it's his. He says all the good dogs are his." Nate studied her. "What's your name, Mia?" she said quickly, as if giving it might cost her. Mia's gaze flicked toward the road. "He keeps them at the warehouse sometimes, the one by the rail line. My brother used to work there." Her mouth tightened. "He got in trouble. Real trouble." She didn't say more, but Nate could hear the story anyway. A young man trying to earn money, getting tangled in something ugly, learning that in a small town, the wrong people can own your future. "Why are you telling me?" Nate asked. Mia shrugged, but her eyes softened when she glanced toward the trailer door. "Because that dog looked like my brother after he came home," she said, and the comparison sat between them like smoke. Quiet, bruised on the inside. Nate felt his throat tighten. "Go home," he said gently, "and don't talk to me in public." Mia nodded fast, relief and fear mixing on her face, then pedaled away hard enough to kick up dust as if she could outrun consequences. That afternoon, Nate stayed with Duke, taking him outside on a short leash to let him smell the air without being overwhelmed. Duke moved stiffly, favoring one hind leg, but he kept his head up more than he had before, eyes scanning the open space with cautious pride. When a car passed on the road, Duke flinched, then steadied when Nate's hand rested calm on his shoulder. It was a small victory, the kind you couldn't measure on paper but could feel in the way a creature chooses to breathe. The knock came at dusk. 3 loud raps on the trailer door, impatient and confident, like the person on the other side believed ownership traveled through wood. Duke's body snapped rigid, and a low sound gathered in his chest, half growl, half pleading. Nate didn't open the door. He stepped to the side where he could see through the narrow window without being seen. A man stood on the steps with a smile that was all teeth. Travis Boone, closer now, looked even more like a problem in human form. His sandy hair was slicked back, beard scruffy, and his eyes were too bright, too entertained. Behind him stood another man, broad and quiet, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. He had a thick neck stubble like sandpaper and the vacant expression of someone who did what he was told for money. Travis knocked again, softer this time, as if switching to charm. "Hey," he called, voice carrying a friendly drawl that didn't match his eyes. "Heard you found a shepherd. I'm the one folks call when dogs get loose." Nate stayed silent. Travis's smile tightened. "Town's small," Travis continued. "Things belong to people. It'd be a shame if you kept something that wasn't yours." Duke's breathing turned quick. Nate felt the old training line up behind his ribs, assess, contain, neutralize, but he forced himself to stay still. He leaned close to the door, voice low and even. "He's not lost," Nate said. "He's hurt." Travis laughed once, short and mean. "Dogs get hurt," he replied, "especially when they run from the wrong hands." The words were a threat dressed as a shrug. Nate's eyes hardened. "Get off my steps," he said quietly. For a moment, Travis didn't move. His gaze flicked toward the inside of the trailer, searching for Duke for proof, for leverage. Then he leaned closer to the door and lowered his voice as if sharing a secret. "You don't know how Moab works," Travis said, "but you will." He stepped back, still smiling, and tapped the doorframe with 2 fingers like a farewell. "See you around," he added, and walked away without hurry, the broad man following like a shadow. Nate waited until the truck engine started and faded down the lane before he exhaled. Inside, Duke stood, trembling eyes fixed on Nate as if asking what the rules were now. Nate knelt, resting his forehead briefly against Duke's neck, feeling the dog's heat and the rapid beat of his heart. "I've got you," he whispered, and it wasn't bravado. It was a vow. Outside, the desert wind rose again, scraping the trailer walls, and Nate understood that the fight he was trying not to have had already been scheduled by someone else. Dawn came soft for once, as if the desert had decided it was tired of scraping at everyone's nerves. Nate sat on the trailer steps with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, listening to Duke breathe behind the screen door. The night after Travis's visit had been a long stretch of half-sleep and full awareness, the kind of vigilance that leaves a man exhausted even when nothing happens. Nate hated how familiar it felt. He'd promised himself he was done living like a perimeter. Yet Duke's presence, warm-wounded, trusting in increments, made it impossible to pretend this was just Nate's problem. When Duke finally eased onto the porch that morning, moving carefully on stiff hind legs, the German Shepherd kept his head higher than he had days ago. His black and tan coat was still dulled by grime and old scabs, but his eyes were clearer, less vacant. He paused at the top step, sniffed the air, and leaned subtly into Nate's knee as if checking whether the world had changed overnight. Nate scratched behind Duke's bent ear and felt the dog's body loosen a fraction. That small surrender was the kind of victory nobody applauded, but it mattered more than noise. Nate made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. Hiding wasn't protecting Duke anymore. Hiding was making Duke easier to steal. He loaded Duke into the truck and drove toward Canyon Paws, because Dr. Hannah Price had been right. People like Travis didn't stop unless the town stopped them. The clinic was already open. Moses, the thick tabby cat with the scarred ear, sat on the counter like a grumpy statue, blinking slowly at Nate as if judging his life choices. Hannah looked up from her paperwork and read Nate's face before he spoke. "He came to your door," Nate said, keeping his voice level. "He wants the dog." Hannah's jaw tightened. In the bright clinic light, the silver in her ponytail looked sharper, like wire. She set down her pen with careful control. "I'm going to document everything," she said. "Photos, injuries, timeline." "That's not drama, Nate. That's evidence." Nate nodded. It felt strange asking the world for help in a way that didn't involve fists. Hannah examined Duke again, her hands confident and gentle. Duke flinched less this time. His trust was still cautious, but it was growing like a plant stubborn enough to push through rock. After she finished, Hannah stepped closer to Nate and lowered her voice. "There's someone you should talk to," she said. "Not because you're a hero, because you're a witness." She scribbled a name and an address on the back of a business card. Sheriff Mark Bennett. Nate had seen the police cruiser around town like a lazy rumor, but he'd never met the man. The sheriff's office sat near the courthouse, a sun-bleached building with a flag that snapped in the wind as if trying to remember pride. Inside, the air smelled like paper and old coffee. Sheriff Mark Bennett stood when Nate entered. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered but softened by age, with a weathered face and a thick gray mustache that made him look like a man carved out of the same canyon rock as the cliffs outside. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of choosing peace by avoiding fights he wasn't sure he could win. His uniform shirt fit neatly, but the way he held himself suggested a man who'd once been straighter before compromise bent him a little. "You're Nate Collins," Bennett said, not asking how he knew. "And that's the dog." Duke stood beside Nate's leg, steady but alert, tail, low ears angled toward every sound. Nate placed Hannah's card on the counter. "Dr. Price documented the injuries," he said, "and Travis Boone came to my door last night." Bennett's mustache twitched. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Travis has been a problem for a long time," he admitted, voice low. "Problem is, folks don't like being the first to say it out loud." Nate felt anger rise, controlled, but hot. "The dog said it out loud," he replied, then immediately hated how the sentence sounded because Duke couldn't speak, yet Duke's body had been shouting for months. Bennett looked down at Duke's scars, and something in his expression shifted old shame mixing with a flicker of resolve. "I need more than a story," Bennett said quietly. "I need people." Nate's mind flashed to Linda's extra broth, Sarah's warning, Mia's trembling honesty. "People are already afraid," Nate said, "but they're watching. If you give them a reason to believe you'll stand, they might stand too." Bennett studied Nate as if weighing the cost of courage. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "Let's do this the clean way." The clean way Nate learned wasn't quick. It was patient and stubborn. Bennett called Hannah to formalize the veterinary report. He made Nate write a statement about the late-night visit. He asked for any witnesses. Nate didn't have names yet, but he had a plan. That afternoon, instead of retreating to the trailer, Nate drove to Red Rock Tavern with Duke in the passenger seat. The bar was quiet at that hour, chairs still upside down on tables. Sarah Whitaker was behind the counter, tall and slender, her honey blonde hair streaked with gray, and tied back, her sun-worn skin glowing softly in the dim light. She looked up, saw Duke, and her face tightened with anger that had nowhere safe to go. Nate didn't waste time. "Travis came to my door," he said. "Sheriff Bennett is willing to act, but he needs people to speak." Sarah's hand paused mid-wipe. For a moment she looked like someone hearing a door creak open in a room she'd lived in, locked for years. Then she exhaled and set the glass down. "I've seen him bring dogs in," she said. "Not just yours. Others. Bruised. Limping." Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes did. "I didn't say anything because you don't stay alive in a small town by being brave every day." Nate nodded. "You don't have to be brave every day," he said. "Just once at the right time." Sarah stared at Duke. Duke met her gaze, steady, not begging, just present. Sarah's shoulders lifted, then settled as if she'd decided to carry a different kind of weight. "I'll talk," she said. "And I know who else might." Word moved the way it always did in small places. Not loud, not announced, but passed hand to hand like contraband hope. Linda Graves from the grocery store came forward the next morning with receipts and dates of dog food purchased in bulk under Travis's name, paid for with cash that didn't match his claimed income. Mia arrived with her hood up, eyes wide, and told Bennett about the warehouse by the rail line and the nights she'd heard dogs crying behind metal walls. Her hands shook, but she spoke anyway, and that was its own kind of heroism. Bennett listened, face grim, and for the first time he looked less like a man avoiding a fight and more like a man preparing to finish one. 2 days later, the sheriff's cruiser and a pair of county vehicles rolled toward the warehouse just after sunset. Nate did not go as an enforcer. He stayed at his trailer with Duke because he refused to let this become a private war. Through the open window, he heard distant sirens, then silence, then the low hum of engines returning. An hour later, Sarah called. "They got him," she said, breath-catching like she couldn't quite believe it. "Travis is in cuffs. They found 3 dogs inside. One's a puppy. They're alive." Nate closed his eyes. He didn't feel triumph. He felt relief so sharp it almost hurt. In the weeks that followed, Moab didn't transform into a fairy tale. The desert still scratched, the wind still howled at night, but the town changed in small, honest ways. People looked up more. Doors stayed unlocked a little longer. At Canyon Paws, Moses the tabby cat allowed Duke to sniff him without hissing, and that alone felt like a peace treaty. Hannah reported Duke's bruises were fading. His limp softened into stiffness that eased with careful walks. Sarah stopped hunching her shoulders when trucks idled outside the tavern. Linda's eyes met Nate's without flinching. And one late afternoon, Nate sat on his porch step with Duke at his side, watching the red cliffs catch fire in the setting sun. Duke's tail thumped once slow and dignified, and Nate laughed quietly, an unfamiliar sound surprised out of him like a bird escaping a cage. He hadn't come to Moab to be seen. He'd come to vanish. But a battered German shepherd had dragged him back into the world, and the world, messy, frightened, stubborn, had answered. Nate rested his hand on Duke's neck and felt the steady beat of a heart that had chosen to keep going. "We're okay," he murmured. And this time the words didn't feel like a wish. They felt like something earned. Sometimes God does not send miracles wrapped in thunder. Sometimes he sends them wrapped in a quiet decision, a hand that chooses gentleness when anger would be easier, a door that opens to protect the broken, a heart that refuses to look away. In Moab, the miracle wasn't that a bad man finally fell. The miracle was that a wounded dog kept believing life could still be kind, and a tired man remembered he was made for more than survival. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us in everyday life. We don't always face villains in the open, but we do face moments where fear tells us to stay silent, where comfort tells us to walk past, where pain tells us to harden. Yet faith asks something different. It asks us to protect what is good to speak when it matters to love with steady courage. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or who this reminded you of. And if you want more stories of faith, courage, and healing, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. May God bless you and your family, keep you safe, and give you strength in the small moments, because that's often where His miracles begin.